What if everything you were taught about America's biggest mistakes was wrong? What if the wars, the divisions, the lost opportunities, and the long scars were not inevitable at all? What if, at a few key moments, different choices led the United States down a calmer, stronger, and far more stable path, one where power grew quietly instead of violently, and unity lasted longer than conflict? Most people assume history only had one possible outcome. But history is shaped by decisions, not destiny. And tonight, we are going to explore a version of America where those decisions went right. Before we begin, I want you to understand something important. This is not about blind patriotism, and it's not about pretending America is perfect. It's about asking a serious question that historians rarely pause to ask. If logic, restraint, and long-term thinking had guided the nation more often, what kind of country would exist today? Would the world look safer? Would Americans live with fewer regrets? Would the idea of freedom feel stronger, not weaker? As we go through this story, you'll notice something unusual. There are fewer dramatic disasters, fewer heroic last stands, and fewer moments of total collapse. And that's exactly the point. The most powerful nations in history are not built on constant chaos. They are built on decisions that prevent chaos from happening in the first place. This story follows that idea from the very beginning. And if you enjoy deep, thoughtful explorations like this, stories that go beyond textbooks and headlines, this is exactly what we do here on the True Archive. If you haven't already, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more content like this in the future. Now let's begin where everything truly changed. Not with myths or slogans, but with a young nation standing at the edge of history, holding far more power than it realized, and facing choices that would shape centuries to come. When people imagine alternate history, they often picture something extreme. Flying machines in the 1800s, impossible technology, or a world that feels more like fiction than reality. But the path we are exploring here is far simpler and far more believable. It doesn't rely on miracles. It relies on restraint. On patience. On leaders choosing stability over ego, and long-term prosperity over short-term glory. From the very beginning, the United States had options. It was young, resource-rich, and protected by oceans. Unlike European powers, it did not need to fight endless wars to survive. Yet again and again in real history, America chose reaction over reflection. In this timeline, the mindset is different. The goal is not domination. The goal is durability. A country that lasts does not rush. It measures every step, knowing that power, once gained too quickly, is often lost just as fast. This version of America still expands, still defends itself, and still believes in freedom. But it does so with a quieter confidence. It understands that strength is not proven by how often you fight, but by how rarely you must. Instead of chasing influence across the world, it focuses on building a society so stable and prosperous that others naturally gravitate toward it. At the True Archive, we often look at moments where history could have turned with just a little more wisdom. This is one of those stories. Not a tale of perfection, but of fewer regrets. Not a nation without flaws, but one that learns faster and repeats mistakes less often. Every decision you're about to hear follows one simple question: does this choice make the country stronger 10 years from now, not just today? With that foundation set, we can now step into the first real test of this alternate America. A moment when independence was won, but the future was still completely uncertain. Because winning freedom is one thing. Knowing how to use it is something else entirely. Independence did not magically make America strong. It only made America free. What came next mattered far more than the victory itself. In this timeline, the leaders of the new nation understood that survival depended on unity, not celebration. The war had drained resources, fractured communities, and left the country vulnerable. Instead of rushing forward with pride, the focus turned inward, toward structure, trust, and discipline. Rather than acting like a loose collection of victorious colonies, the states moved quickly to behave like a single nation. Disputes between regions were addressed early, before resentment had time to grow. Compromise was not seen as weakness, but as insurance against collapse. The federal government remained limited, but respected. Strong enough to hold the nation together, yet careful not to smother local authority. This America also understood its greatest advantage. Geography. Two massive oceans acted as natural shields, buying time that no European power could dream of having. Instead of wasting that advantage on unnecessary conflict, the country used it to stabilize its economy and institutions. Trade expanded. Ports grew. Internal roads and connections slowly linked the states together, making separation less appealing with every passing year. Military power existed, but it was controlled. There was no obsession with glory or conquest. Defense came first. Preparedness mattered more than aggression. This balance created something rare in history, a young nation that was alert without being paranoid, and confident without being reckless. By the time foreign powers fully accepted that American independence was permanent, the United States was no longer fragile. It was organized. It had rules that people believed in, and leaders who understood that the real revolution was not fought on battlefields, but in courtrooms, assemblies, and everyday life. With that foundation secured, the next challenge emerged. Expansion. Opportunity stretched outward in every direction, and the question was no longer whether America would grow, but how carefully it would do so. Growth was inevitable. Land meant opportunity, security, and economic breathing room. But in this version of history, expansion was treated like a long-term investment, not a race. Leaders understood that taking land was easy. Integrating it was hard. So instead of grabbing everything within reach, the nation moved step by step, making sure each gain strengthened the Union instead of stretching it thin. New territories were not just claimed. They were prepared. Infrastructure came before population surges. Clear rules were established early, so settlers, local communities, and state governments all knew where they stood. This reduced chaos and prevented the cycle of lawlessness that so often poisons frontier growth. Expansion did not feel like conquest. It felt like extension. Diplomacy played a larger role than force. When tensions rose with neighboring powers, negotiations were given real time to work. War remained a last resort, not a shortcut. This restraint preserved resources and prevented the kind of bitterness that lingers long after battles end. Every avoided war was a generation spared from trauma. Population growth became America's quiet weapon. Instead of draining lives in constant conflict, the nation allowed its numbers to rise naturally. A larger population meant more labor, more innovation, and more internal strength. Over time, this advantage became impossible to ignore. The country did not need to prove itself through destruction. Its growth spoke for itself. As the borders expanded, something important became clear. The greatest threats to the nation were no longer foreign armies, but internal imbalance. The question of power, labor, and human rights loomed ahead. And the way America chose to face those challenges would determine whether unity survived or shattered. Every rising nation reaches a moment where pride tempts it into shortcuts. In real history, those shortcuts often came in the form of rushed wars, political stubbornness, and leaders refusing to admit when a path was failing. In this timeline, America pauses instead of charging forward. The lesson is learned early: mistakes grow more expensive the longer they are ignored. When conflicts begin to form, especially between regions and economic interests, they are addressed before they harden into hatred. Leaders listen more than they speak. Compromise happens behind closed doors, away from public spectacle. The goal is not to win arguments, but to keep the system working. This prevents small disagreements from turning into national crises. Foreign conflicts are also handled differently. Rather than reacting emotionally to every insult or provocation, the nation measures consequences. Leaders ask what happens after the war is over, not just how to win it. Many confrontations simply fade when denied attention. Others are resolved through trade pressure and diplomacy. The result is a country that conserves strength while others waste it. Economic discipline becomes another safeguard. Instead of gambling on quick profits or reckless policies, stability is favored. The government avoids overreach while still setting clear rules. This balance builds trust among citizens and investors alike. People begin to believe that tomorrow will look better than today, and that belief becomes self-fulfilling. By avoiding these early mistakes, America enters the middle of the 19th century with something rare. Momentum without exhaustion. Growth without desperation. But one challenge remains unavoidable. A moral and economic contradiction that can no longer be ignored. And how the nation confronts it will define everything that follows. Slavery was the deepest wound in the American experiment. It poisoned politics, distorted the economy, and threatened to tear the nation apart. In this timeline, leaders accept a hard truth earlier than in real history. A country built on freedom cannot survive while denying it to millions. The question is no longer if slavery will end, but how much damage it will cause before it does. Instead of allowing tensions to boil for decades, the federal government takes a firmer role sooner. It does not rush blindly into total war, but it refuses to look away. Clear limits are placed on the expansion of slavery, cutting off its future growth. Economic incentives begin shifting away from systems that rely on forced labor, weakening slavery's grip without collapsing entire regions overnight. When conflict finally erupts, it is shorter and more controlled. The goal is restoration, not punishment. Leadership on both sides understands that a shattered nation benefits no one. Military action is decisive, not prolonged. The fighting ends before hatred becomes generational, and before infrastructure is reduced to ashes. What follows matters just as much as the conflict itself. Instead of abandoning formerly enslaved people to uncertainty, the government acts as a stabilizing force. Land access, legal protection, and economic opportunity are prioritized. This creates independence instead of dependency. Freed families are no longer trapped by the same systems that once controlled them. By preventing a long occupation of bitterness, the nation avoids the rise of deeply entrenched discrimination laws. Representation grows naturally. Communities rebuild together instead of retreating into resentment. The scars of slavery remain, but they do not define every generation that follows. With unity preserved and the nation intact, America now faces a new question. How large should it become? And how far should its influence reach? With internal unity largely preserved, America enters a period of steady growth. Not explosive. Not reckless. Just consistent. New territories are welcomed with clear expectations and equal footing, preventing the feeling of permanent outsiders. Growth is framed as shared progress, not domination by older states. Immigration becomes a defining strength rather than a source of fear. People arrive from many regions, bringing skills, languages, and traditions. Instead of forcing sameness, the nation allows identity to evolve naturally. English becomes the common thread, but not a weapon. Communities retain their culture while participating fully in national life. Regional identity strengthens rather than weakens the union. States develop distinct economic roles. Some focus on industry, others on trade, agriculture, or innovation. Competition exists, but it is productive. States learn from each other instead of racing to undercut one another. This diversity of systems creates resilience when challenges arise. Importantly, growth does not erase restraint. The country resists the temptation to measure success by how much land it controls. Influence comes from stability, not size alone. By choosing integration over domination, America avoids becoming an empire stretched beyond its limits. As the 19th century closes, the nation stands strong, wealthy, and confident. But the world beyond its borders is growing more dangerous. Empires are clashing. Alliances are forming. And for the first time, America must decide whether to step onto the global stage, or remain deliberately apart from it. As the world moves toward large-scale conflict, pressure builds on America to take sides. Powerful nations expect support. Newspapers call for action. But in this timeline, restraint once again wins. American leaders recognize that global wars rarely solve the problems that start them. They only transfer suffering from one generation to the next. Instead of entering distant conflicts, the nation commits fully to neutrality. Trade continues with all sides under strict rules. American ships are protected, not provocative. This stance frustrates foreign powers, but it also forces them to respect boundaries. No one wants to push America into a war it does not want to fight. Neutrality brings unexpected benefits. The economy grows steadily while others strain under military spending. Innovation accelerates at home. Immigrant communities remain united rather than divided by foreign loyalties. The country becomes a place of refuge for talent, not a factory for soldiers. Most importantly, staying out of global chaos prevents moral exhaustion. The nation is not haunted by distant battlefields or lost generations. Its confidence is quiet but firm. Power accumulates naturally instead of being seized violently. As wars reshape other continents, America emerges stronger simply by remaining whole. And with that strength comes a new challenge. How to manage prosperity without letting it spiral into instability. Prosperity can be just as dangerous as poverty if it isn't managed carefully. In this timeline, America avoids the sharp highs and crushing lows that define so much of modern economic history. Without massive war debts or sudden military drawdowns, the economy grows at a steadier pace. It is not explosive, but it is reliable. People plan their lives with confidence, knowing that tomorrow is unlikely to collapse overnight. Industry remains rooted at home. Jobs are not shipped away in search of cheaper labor because stability, not speed, drives decision-making. Skilled workers are valued. Apprenticeships and long-term employment become normal again. Entire regions grow wealthy by specializing in what they do best, rather than competing in a race to the bottom. Infrastructure becomes a quiet priority. Cities invest in transport, housing, and public systems that make everyday life easier. Growth is planned, not improvised. As a result, urban centers expand without hollowing out. Neighborhoods remain connected. Communities form around shared spaces instead of being fractured by neglect. The government plays a limited but steady role. It avoids heavy-handed control, yet refuses to abandon responsibility. Markets are allowed to function, but clear rules prevent exploitation from becoming normalized. This balance keeps trust high and panic low. By the time the nation enters the mid-20th century, it is wealthy without being fragile. Powerful without being overstretched. But economic success alone does not guarantee social harmony. The next test is whether prosperity can coexist with fairness and dignity for all. Because the nation avoided long, brutal internal conflicts and destructive global wars, American society develops differently. Trauma does not stack generation after generation. Fear never becomes the dominant political tool. People disagree, sometimes fiercely, but the disagreements do not harden into permanent cultural warfare. Without the collapse of entire regions or the rise of unchecked hate movements, communities remain more integrated. Federal protection in earlier decades prevents discriminatory systems from becoming deeply embedded. Equal rights expand gradually but steadily, driven as much by economic logic as by moral pressure. States that embrace inclusion grow faster, and others follow when the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Diversity is no longer framed as a threat. It is simply a fact of life. Multiple languages, traditions, and beliefs coexist without constant tension because no single group feels permanently pushed to the margins. Representation grows naturally as communities gain stability and confidence. Cities benefit the most from this environment. Architecture is preserved rather than erased. Neighborhoods are valued rather than abandoned. People feel connected to the places they live, not trapped by them. Civic pride becomes personal, rooted in daily experience rather than slogans. By the time America reaches the later decades of the century, it is not just wealthy. It is cohesive. And that cohesion creates a form of power that no army can manufacture. A society that believes in itself is difficult to destabilize. Now, with unity at home and strength abroad, the nation steps into a role few others have ever managed to hold responsibly. Power arrives quietly. There is no single moment when America declares itself dominant. No dramatic announcement. No victory parade over a defeated world. Instead, other nations slowly realize something unsettling. The United States does not need to prove its strength. It simply exists with it. Because the country avoided endless wars, its resources were never drained by constant rebuilding. Its population grew without interruption. Its institutions matured instead of being rewritten after every crisis. Over time, this stability became influence. Nations began to measure themselves against America not militarily, but structurally. Could they provide the same opportunities? The same security? The same sense of long-term direction? American influence spread through trade, culture, and example. Businesses partnered rather than conquered. Ideas traveled faster than armies ever could. When conflicts erupted elsewhere, America was not expected to lead invasions. It was asked to mediate, invest, and stabilize. And it could afford to do so without desperation. Patriotism in this America feels different. It is confident without being loud. Pride comes from preservation, not conquest. Citizens do not fear decline because they have never experienced sudden collapse. They expect continuity. That expectation alone shapes behavior, encouraging responsibility over reaction. By the end of the century, America is widely acknowledged as the most powerful nation on earth. Not because it controls the most territory, but because it controls its own future. And with that future comes one final question. What does the world look like after decades of this quiet dominance? As the new millennium approaches, the shape of the world is unmistakably different. Conflict still exists, but it is less catastrophic. Power is more evenly distributed. And at the center of it all stands an America that never chased empire, yet somehow became the most influential force on the planet. The population is vast, diverse, and confident. Generations have grown up without the shadow of total war or economic collapse. People plan long lives instead of bracing for disasters. Education, trade, and innovation flow steadily. The nation's size and wealth are not viewed with fear, because they were never built through destruction. Other countries measure progress differently now. Instead of competing to build larger militaries, many compete to build stronger institutions. Stability becomes desirable. Neutrality becomes respectable. Trade replaces conquest as the preferred path to influence. In this way, America shapes the world without commanding it. At home, life feels grounded. Cities are vibrant. Regions retain distinct identities while remaining deeply connected. The country does not feel fragile or divided. Disagreements still exist, but they are solved within a system people trust. This America reaches the year 2000 not exhausted, not defensive, and not uncertain. It arrives calm, secure, and prepared to face whatever comes next. But before we close this story, there is one final step. Stepping back to ask what all of this truly means. When you step back and look at this version of history, one truth becomes clear. The most important moments were not the battles that were won, but the ones that never happened. The loudest victories were avoided, and in their place grew something far more rare. Consistency. Trust. Continuity. This timeline is not about perfection. Mistakes still happened. Conflicts still emerged. But they were handled before they hardened into permanent scars. Decisions were made with the next generation in mind, not the next election or headline. And over time, those choices compounded into strength. It challenges a common belief that progress requires suffering. That nations must be tested by fire to become great. This story suggests the opposite. That restraint can be just as powerful as force. That patience can outperform aggression. And that stability, when protected, becomes a form of quiet dominance. Now here's where this story becomes personal. If one decision can redirect an entire nation, what do smaller decisions do in our own lives? What paths have been shaped not by necessity, but by habit? And which mistakes do we continue simply because they feel familiar? If you disagree with this timeline, or if you think a different choice would have mattered more, I want to hear it. Thoughtful disagreement is how understanding grows. And conversations like these are exactly why the True Archive exists. We're almost at the end. But before we close, there's one more thing that helps stories like this reach the people who care about them most. If this alternate path made you stop and think, don't keep that thought to yourself. History becomes far more interesting when it turns into a conversation. Scroll down and tell me this. What single decision do you think mattered most in shaping America's future? Or if you could change just one moment in history, which would it be, and why? Your comments don't just help the algorithm. They help shape future discussions on the True Archive. Many of the ideas explored here come directly from debates started by viewers who are willing to think deeper and challenge assumptions. If you see a comment you disagree with, respond to it. That's how better questions get asked. And if you know someone who loves history, alternate timelines, or thoughtful long-form storytelling, share this video with them. Send it to a friend, post it in a group, or save it for later. These stories are meant to be discussed, not forgotten after one watch. Now, let's bring everything together with one final thought. History often celebrates the loudest moments. The wars. The revolutions. The dramatic turning points that feel larger than life. But when you look closely, it's usually the quiet choices that shape the longest futures. The decisions made without applause. The restraint shown when force was easier. The patience to wait when rushing would have felt heroic. This version of America did not become strong by dominating the world. It became strong by mastering itself. By choosing stability over spectacle, unity over ego, and long-term thinking over short-term emotion. Its power was not built on fear or destruction, but on trust, continuity, and confidence passed from one generation to the next. Whether this path could have truly happened will always be debated. But the lesson remains real. Nations, like people, are defined less by what they survive and more by what they choose to avoid. And sometimes, the best move is the one that never makes headlines. If stories like this made you see history from a new angle, stay curious. Stay questioning. And keep exploring the moments that shaped our world with us here at the True Archive.